when rising theater actress Rachel Buffett fell in love with fellow performer Daniel Wozniak. Their lives looked like a fairy tale scripted for the stage. But behind the curtain lay a chilling secret: 2 murders, a stolen fortune, and a shocking question that would haunt investigators. How much did Rachel really know? In the summer of 2010, the quiet city of Costa Mesa, California, became the center of a story that seemed almost scripted for the stage. Except this story was real, and its ending was horrifying. At its center was Rachel Buffett, a 28-year-old theater actress known locally for her performances in community productions and her role as a Disney cast member at nearby theme parks. She was attractive, talented, and ambitious, often described by friends as charming and intelligent. She was engaged to Daniel Patrick Wozniak, a 31-year-old actor and singer who shared her love for the stage. Together, they looked like the perfect couple, 2 creative souls planning their wedding, rehearsing for plays, and living out a life that appeared, from the outside, entirely ordinary. They met in the world of community theater, where long rehearsals and tight-knit casts often blurred the line between performance and real life. Daniel, or Dan, as his friends called him, was well-liked for his easy charisma and his voice, smooth, confident, the kind that filled small stages with presence. Rachel, with her bright smile and natural poise, was equally magnetic. They performed together in several shows and became a fixture in their theater circle. Offstage, they were planning a wedding for later that spring and a honeymoon cruise that would take them away from their modest Orange County routines. It all seemed perfect, until May 2010, when 2 people connected to their world were brutally murdered. The victims were Sam, 26, and Julie Kibushi, 23. Sam was an Army veteran who had served in Afghanistan. After returning home, he enrolled at Orange Coast College, where he studied theater and became part of the same artistic community as Rachel and Dan. Julie was one of his close friends, a talented dancer and fashion student who often helped him with classwork. They were young, driven, and trusted by everyone around them. No one could have imagined how their lives would intersect with Rachel and Dan's in a way that would end in tragedy. On May 22, 2010, police in Costa Mesa responded to a call from Sam Hare's apartment complex. Sam's father, Steve, had gone to check on his son after he stopped answering calls. When Steve entered the apartment, he found Julie Kibushi's body on the bed. She had been shot in the head. Police quickly realized the scene was staged. A cryptic message had been written on her clothes suggesting jealousy or infidelity, a detail that immediately struck investigators as suspicious. Sam was missing, and at first, police feared he might be responsible. But within hours, that theory began to unravel. As detectives dug deeper, they traced Sam's ATM card and phone activity. Someone had been using his card to withdraw cash from several locations across Orange County. Surveillance footage revealed it wasn't Sam, but a teenage boy. When officers detained the teen, he confessed that he was acting under the direction of an older man, a man named Daniel Wozniak. He told police that Wozniak had given him instructions, told him what to say if questioned, and even promised him money. It didn't take long for investigators to connect the dots. Daniel Wozniak was an actor in the same small theater community as Sam and Julie. He was also engaged to Rachel Buffett. When police arrived to arrest Wozniak, he was at a bachelor party in the middle of a performance weekend. According to witnesses, he appeared calm, even cheerful. The contrast between his demeanor and the crimes he was accused of was staggering. During questioning, detectives discovered a chilling motive. Wozniak had killed Sam Hair to steal his savings, money Sam had set aside from his military service, to pay for his upcoming wedding and honeymoon with Rachel. But the story didn't end there. To cover up his first crime, Wozniak lured Julie Kibushi to Sam's apartment using Sam's phone, shot her, and staged a scene to make it look like a crime of passion committed by Sam himself. It was a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators and delay suspicion. When the details emerged, Costa Mesa police were stunned. The plan was both cruel and calculated, with a clear trail of deception. Wozniak confessed in detail after hours of interrogation, admitting that he had killed both Sam and Julie. He showed police where he had dismembered Sam's body and left parts of it in a nearby park. The brutality of the crime and the sheer coldness behind it horrified the community. The story made headlines across California almost instantly. A struggling actor accused of killing two innocent people for money, right before his own wedding. But one question remained. How much did Rachel Buffett know? From the beginning, she played the role of the devastated fiancé. She told reporters she was blindsided by Dan's confession and that she couldn't reconcile the man she loved with the killer described by police. She gave interviews to national outlets, including Good Morning America, saying she had no idea what had happened until the arrest. To many, she seemed like another victim, caught in the middle of a nightmare she didn't create. But to investigators, something didn't add up. Detectives reviewed Rachel's statements and compared them with the evidence. They noticed inconsistencies. In one version, she said she had been at home during key moments when Wozniak was moving Sam's belongings and hiding evidence. In another, she hinted that she had helped him retrieve items. There were also phone records showing messages exchanged between them during the critical hours following the murders. Some officers believed she might have helped him create his alibi, or at least knew more than she admitted. As the months went on, the case against Wozniak grew stronger. But questions about Rachel lingered. Friends from the theater world were divided. Some defended her as innocent, saying she had been manipulated by Dan just like everyone else, while others quietly admitted they weren't so sure. She had been close to the situation, they said, and seemed too calm for someone completely blindsided by such monstrous acts. Rachel continued to live in Orange County as the legal proceedings against Dan moved forward. She visited him in jail several times, which raised eyebrows among investigators who wondered if she still supported him. At one point, she reportedly told police she didn't believe Dan had killed anyone, even after his confession. Detectives saw this as another sign of denial or possible complicity. Behind the calm exterior of a former actress, they suspected there was more involvement than she wanted to admit. Forensic evidence and testimony slowly painted the picture of a calculated scheme. Daniel Wozniak had plotted the murders to steal money from Sam Hare's bank account, using the funds to cover debts and wedding costs. He had convinced a teenager to help him withdraw cash using Sam's card. He had staged Julie's body to make the murder look like a crime of jealousy. And through it all, investigators wondered whether Rachel Buffett had played a role in keeping those lies alive. By 2012, prosecutors were ready to act. The Orange County District Attorney's Office charged Rachel Buffett with being an accessory after the fact and lying to police. She was accused of helping to mislead investigators and obstruct the early stages of the murder investigation. While she wasn't accused of participating in the killings themselves, prosecutors alleged that she had provided false information to protect Wozniak and to delay his capture. The charges were a turning point. What had once looked like the tragic fallout of one man's greed now expanded to include questions about loyalty, deception, and how far someone would go to protect a loved one. Rachel maintained her innocence, saying she had done nothing wrong and that she was being punished for believing in the man she loved. But to investigators, her behavior was too carefully rehearsed, her answers too vague. The public, already fascinated by the case, now had another figure to focus on, the actress, who may have known more than she said. For years, Rachel's image had been one of the innocent partner, the woman who stood by a man accused of the unthinkable. But as the evidence came forward, that image began to fracture. By the time Daniel Wozniak's murder trial neared, Rachel Buffett was no longer a side character in the story. She was part of the investigation, part of the deception, and soon to be part of the court record. The murders of Sam Hare and Julie Kibushi had already destroyed two families. Now the search for the full truth was about to reveal whether Rachel Buffett's loyalty had crossed the line from love into crime. And as prosecutors prepared their case, the curtain was about to rise on the next act, a courtroom drama where the actress, who once played roles of innocence and warmth, would finally have to play herself under oath. The arrest of Daniel Wozniak had brought the gruesome truth about the murders of Sam Hare and Julie Kibushi into focus, but it left another question hanging in the air. How much did Rachel Buffett know? And when did she know it? For investigators in Costa Mesa, the answer to that question became almost as important as solving the murders themselves. Rachel had been by Dan's side through every step of his double life, acting on stage, planning their wedding, and talking about a future that never existed. To the public, she was either the innocent fiancée blindsided by a psychopath or a skilled actress who used charm and calmness to help him conceal a crime. Detectives weren't sure which version of her was real. In the weeks after Dan's confession, Rachel seemed to play the part of a confused young woman whose world had fallen apart. She gave interviews to national outlets, telling reporters she had no idea what her fiancé was capable of. On Good Morning America, she described how she felt betrayed and heartbroken, insisting she didn't learn the truth until the day police arrested him. She said she had loved him deeply and couldn't reconcile the man she knew with the killer the police described. It was an emotional performance, and many people believed her. But the detectives who had spoken with her privately noticed cracks in her story. They found it hard to accept that she knew nothing, not when she had been living with him, rehearsing with him, and planning a wedding that he intended to fund with stolen money. Rachel and Dan had shared everything. They were partners not only in theater, but in life. They rehearsed side by side at the Hunger Artist Theater Company in Fullerton, where friends described them as friendly and charismatic, the couple everyone noticed. Behind that image, though, there were signs of financial strain. Dan had lost his job and was deeply in debt. He owed money to several friends and was behind on rent. He had promised Rachel a beautiful wedding and an extravagant honeymoon cruise, but he didn't have the means to pay for it. That financial pressure, prosecutors later argued, was the spark that pushed him toward murder. When detectives went back over Rachel's early statements, they found inconsistencies that stood out. She had told police she didn't know where Dan had been on the day Sam was killed, but later admitted that he mentioned helping Sam move furniture. She had said she didn't know why Dan needed extra cash, yet she was fully involved in planning their wedding, and had asked friends about venues and decorations during the same week the murders took place. There were also phone records showing that she had been in communication with Dan around the time he was disposing of Sam's remains. To investigators, the picture was changing. She might not have participated in the killings, but her behavior after them suggested she was protecting him. In the months following the murders, Rachel visited Dan several times in jail. At first, she appeared supportive. She told friends she didn't believe he was guilty, that there had to be another explanation. Those visits raised eyebrows. Detectives wondered whether she was still helping him maintain his version of events. It was during one of those visits that she reportedly told him she was being questioned again by police. According to investigators, Dan encouraged her to stay strong and remember what they talked about. That statement, while vague, made detectives even more suspicious that the two had coordinated their stories. By 2012, the Orange County District Attorney's Office had gathered enough evidence to charge Rachel with being an accessory after the fact and lying to police. She was accused of giving false information during the investigation, particularly about Dan's actions on the days surrounding the murders. The charges did not accuse her of taking part in the killings, but they placed her squarely in the middle of the cover-up. For years, the case had been about one man's horrific choices. Now it was also about a woman's silence and the consequences of loyalty taken too far. While Rachel awaited trial, Daniel Wozniak's case moved forward. In 2015, he finally faced a jury. The courtroom was packed with reporters, the victims' families, and members of the community who had followed the case since the beginning. Over several days, prosecutors detailed how he lured Sam Hurt to an empty apartment, shot him, and dismembered his body, then murdered Julie Kabushi to cover his tracks. They showed how he used Sam's phone to send fake messages, withdrew cash from his account using a teenage accomplice, and continued performing in a stage musical as if nothing had happened. The motive was simple and horrifying: money for a wedding and honeymoon with Rachel Buffett. When the guilty verdict came, no one was surprised. The jury recommended the death penalty, and in 2016, Daniel Wozniak was formally sentenced to death. For the families of Sam and Julie, the sentence provided justice, but not peace. Steve Herr, Sam's father, said, "We've been through hell. There's no end to it. But at least we know who did this." For Rachel, the verdict marked the moment her connection to Dan stopped being personal and became public record. Her name appeared in nearly every news story about him, often followed by the words actress fiancé. She was no longer just the woman who had loved a killer. She was the woman accused of helping him. As Rachel's own trial approached in 2018, prosecutors made it clear that her case was about accountability. She wasn't being tried for murder, but for the lies that hindered justice. They argued that her actions, small omissions, misleading statements, and half-truths, had slowed the investigation during its crucial early days. Detectives testified that if she had been honest, they might have found Sam Herr's body sooner or prevented the delay in identifying Julie Kibushi's killer. One detective said, "She wasn't just another witness. She had information that mattered." Rachel's defense team countered that she was a victim herself, a young woman manipulated by a man who had fooled everyone. They said she had no reason to suspect Dan of murder, and that any inaccurate statements she made were the result of shock, confusion, and emotional trauma. They emphasized that she had cooperated with police, attended interviews voluntarily, and had not fled or destroyed evidence. She didn't kill anyone, her lawyer told the jury. She was trying to process something unimaginable. In court, Rachel appeared composed, almost serene. She wore modest clothing, kept her hair tied back, and avoided eye contact with reporters. The woman who had once played lively characters on stage now sat silently as prosecutors replayed her police interviews. Jurors heard her voice as she told investigators that she thought Sam had hurt Julie, a statement prosecutors said was meant to divert attention away from Dan. They also played clips where she said she didn't know what Dan had been doing the day Sam disappeared, contradicted by phone and text records showing they had spoken multiple times that day. The prosecution argued that Rachel's lies were intentional. They pointed to the timing of her statements and her relationship with Dan as proof she knew more than she claimed. They suggested that her acting background helped her maintain her composure under pressure and present herself as credible when she wasn't. It wasn't that she had written the script, they said, it was that she had stuck to it. The defense maintained she had no knowledge of the murders and that her behavior reflected fear, not guilt. They painted her as a woman who had been emotionally controlled by a manipulative partner, too blinded by love to see the truth. Friends who testified for the defense described Rachel as gentle and naive, someone who trusted easily and avoided confrontation. Throughout the trial, the families of Sam Herr and Julie Kibushi attended every hearing. They listened quietly, hoping to understand why anyone connected to the man who killed their children had chosen silence over honesty. Julie's father said after one hearing, "It's not about her killing anyone. It's about her knowing and saying nothing. That's hard to forgive." When closing arguments ended, the courtroom fell into tense silence. The jury was left to decide whether Rachel Buffett's words were lies told to protect a murderer or the confused statements of a woman in shock. The trial had revealed how easily truth can blur when love, fear, and loyalty collide. As the jurors began deliberating, reporters gathered outside the courthouse, waiting for the verdict. After 8 years of headlines, interviews, and speculation, the public was about to find out whether Rachel Buffett's story would end as tragedy or complicity. Her fate, like the entire case, rested on one haunting question. When the truth was within reach, why hadn't she spoken it? The jury deliberated for nearly 2 days before returning to the courtroom. When Rachel Buffett stood to hear the verdict, she kept her eyes fixed on the judge. The clerk read the decision aloud. Guilty on 2 counts of being an accessory after the fact, and 1 count of lying to police. The room was silent except for the voices of the court officers. Rachel showed little emotion. Behind her, the families of Sam Herr and Julie Kibushi sat quietly, absorbing what justice now meant for them. It wasn't the same as the death sentence handed to Daniel Wozniak, but it was, as one of the victim's relatives put it, a measure of truth finally being acknowledged. Prosecutors described Rachel's crimes as deliberate acts that prolonged the suffering of 2 families. They argued she had every opportunity to tell investigators the truth, but instead chose to mislead them to protect Wozniak. In their view, her deception had given a murderer time to destroy evidence and to twist the story in his favor. During sentencing, prosecutor Matt Murphy said, "Her words mattered. Every lie delayed justice. Every delay deepened the pain for the families." The defense asked for leniency, insisting that Rachel was not a danger to anyone and had already lost everything: her career, her reputation, and the future she once dreamed of. They said she was manipulated by Wozniak, trapped in a relationship that blurred her judgment. Rachel's attorney told the court she was deceived by a man she loved and reacted out of fear and confusion, not malice. He argued that her lies were not meant to obstruct justice, but were a misguided attempt to make sense of a reality that shattered overnight. Before sentencing, Rachel spoke briefly. Her voice was steady but quiet as she said she never intended to hurt anyone and that she wished she had done more to help the investigation. "I was overwhelmed," she said. "I made mistakes. I was scared." Her words were short, and she offered no further explanation. Some in the courtroom believed her tone was genuine. Others thought it was too controlled, too polished, like an actress reading lines. The judge sentenced Rachel Buffett to jail time, probation, and ordered her to pay restitution. The punishment was far lighter than that of Daniel Wozniak, but the verdict officially marked her as part of one of Orange County's darkest crimes. For many who followed the case, it closed a chapter that had lingered for almost a decade. The judge told her, "You may not have pulled the trigger, but your actions helped a murderer stay hidden longer. That is something you will have to live with." In the months following her conviction, Rachel disappeared from public life. She avoided interviews, declined requests from documentary producers, and quietly served her sentence. Her acting career ended permanently. To those who once knew her, she became a cautionary tale, a reminder that silence can be as damaging as action. Her former theater colleagues said they struggled to understand how someone so poised and intelligent could have ignored what was right in front of her. Meanwhile, Daniel Wozniak remained on death row at San Quentin State Prison. His conviction and death sentence were upheld on appeal, and he continues to await execution. Prosecutors described him as one of the most manipulative defendants they had ever encountered, an actor who played the role of innocence until the moment his lies collapsed. The families of Sam Herr and Julie Kibushi never stopped speaking publicly about their loss. They described both victims as kind, talented, and full of life. Julie's parents said their daughter had been the kind of person who helped everyone she met, while Sam's father remembered his son as a soldier who survived war only to be murdered by someone he trusted. For them, Rachel's conviction was small comfort, but it represented accountability, an acknowledgement that her silence had consequences. By 2019, the case had entered the national conversation about loyalty, truth, and the psychology of manipulation. True crime programs revisited the story, describing it as a tragic intersection of love, ambition, and moral collapse. Commentators noted how Rachel's calm demeanor, once a strength on stage, had become her most controversial trait off it. Some believed she was a naive woman caught in the gravitational pull of a psychopath. Others saw her as a willing accomplice who cared more about protecting her image than telling the truth. The theme that emerged from the story was one of deception, how easily charm can hide cruelty, and how loyalty can turn dangerous when it blinds people to reality. Rachel Buffett's case became a symbol of how ordinary people can find themselves on the wrong side of morality, not through violence, but through silence. Her downfall wasn't written in blood, but in the words she chose to say, and the truths she chose not to. Looking back, investigators like Detective Ed Everett said the turning point had been Rachel's interviews. The inconsistencies in her stories, the measured tone, and the small but telling lies had changed her from a potential witness into a defendant. She had the chance to help us, he said later. Instead, she helped him. Today, the story of Rachel Buffett and Daniel Wozniak remains one of Southern California's most chilling true crime cases. Two promising young lives were lost for greed, and two performers, the actor and the actress, became forever linked by deception. The curtain finally closed with Wozniak on death row and Buffett branded an accessory to his crimes. Both their stages gone dark. It is a story that still echoes in the quiet streets of Costa Mesa. A story of love warped by lies, ambition undone by greed, and truth buried beneath performance. And at the heart of it all, one haunting question endures. When faced with the choice between love and truth, why did Rachel Buffett choose silence? In 2025, in the quiet coastal town of Port Lincoln, South Australia, a former reality TV star vanished from a spotlight, only to reappear in a nightmare. When police entered her home on Flinders Highway, they uncovered something so horrifying it stunned the nation. What truly happened inside that house? Port Lincoln, a quiet coastal town in South Australia, is known for its fishing boats, open seas, and calm routines. It is not the kind of place where people expect to hear about brutal crimes. But in June 2025, that peace was shattered when police discovered a horrific scene inside a modest home on Flinders Highway. The case would soon make headlines across Australia and beyond. The murder of 39-year-old Julian Story, allegedly at the hands of his partner, Tamika Chesser, a former reality TV contestant once known for her lively personality and television fame. Tamika Chesser, 34, had been a contestant years earlier on Beauty and the Geek Australia. Back then, she came across as bright and outspoken, a young woman looking for fun and recognition. But by 2025, life had taken a darker turn. She was living in Port Lincoln, far from her television days, with Julian Story, a man in his late 30s, described by locals as friendly, down-to-earth, and well-liked. Julian worked casually in local trades and sometimes helped with boat maintenance jobs. Friends said he had met Tamika not long before moving in together. Their relationship was said to be passionate but volatile. Neighbors often saw them together, laughing one day, arguing the next. Some described hearing shouting from the house, though no one ever thought it would end in tragedy. In small towns, people tend to mind their own business. But what went on inside that house in mid-June would soon draw national attention and leave Port Lincoln shaken. According to police, the timeline begins around Tuesday, June 17, 2025. It was late at night when something went terribly wrong inside the couple's unit. The next 2 days would reveal a series of shocking discoveries. Investigators believe that sometime around midnight, Julian Story was killed in what they would later call one of the most disturbing crimes the region had seen in years. The details are grim: dismemberment, burning of remains, and an attempt to conceal what had happened. 2 days later, on Thursday, June 19th, just before 4 p.m., emergency services were called to the couple's home after reports of a small fire in the backyard. Firefighters arrived expecting a minor grass or bin fire. What they found instead would stay with them forever. Inside the yard, they discovered what looked like charred remains. The fire had been set close to a garden chair where a woman was sitting, silent and motionless. It was Tamika Chesser. She was described as dazed and unresponsive. Nearby, officers found evidence of human remains, partially burned, later confirmed to belong to Julian Story. His head was missing. Detectives quickly cordoned off the area. Forensic teams moved in, photographing every inch of the small property. Neighbors watched from their driveways, stunned. Some said they had noticed smoke, but assumed it was someone burning rubbish. Others remembered seeing police cars speeding down the highway earlier that afternoon. By evening, word spread that a possible homicide had occurred. Within hours, Tamika Chesser was arrested. She was taken into custody and charged with murder, improper disposal of a body, and assaulting a police officer. Reports later revealed that she had lashed out during her arrest. Her mental state appeared unstable, and she was placed under a psychiatric detention order and transferred to James Nash House, a secure mental health facility in Adelaide. At her first brief court appearance, she sat quietly, eyes down, as the charges were read. Her identity was initially suppressed, but within days, a judge lifted the order, confirming that the accused was indeed the former reality TV contestant. The revelation sparked a wave of media coverage. The story dominated national news. Television networks replayed clips from Beauty and the Geek, contrasting her cheerful on-screen personality with the grim reality of the case. Reporters flooded Port Lincoln, interviewing neighbors, friends, and anyone who had known her. Some expressed disbelief. "She was always so friendly," one neighbor told a local station. "I can't imagine her doing something like that." Others, however, recalled hearing angry voices and loud arguments in the days before the murder. Investigators immediately began piecing together the timeline. They focused on Tamika's movements between June 17th and June 19th, the period during which they believed Julian was killed and his remains disposed of. Police appealed to the public for help, asking anyone with CCTV or dashcam footage from around Flinders Highway to come forward. They also began searching the surrounding areas, bushland, coastline, and open fields, for the missing head and any other remains that might have been scattered or buried. The search quickly became one of the largest in Port Lincoln's history. Dozens of police officers, state emergency service volunteers, and forensic specialists combed through scrubland and beaches. Drones and dogs were brought in. Helicopters flew overhead, scanning the rugged terrain around the city. Local fishermen checked their boats and shoreline for anything suspicious. At the same time, investigators dug into Tamika's background. They found that she had moved to Port Lincoln only recently. Before that, she had been living in Adelaide, struggling with personal and financial problems. Friends described her as troubled in recent years, with periods of isolation and erratic behavior. She had once chased a career in entertainment, but had faded from public life. Those who knew her in Port Lincoln said she kept mostly to herself, spending time with Julian and rarely socializing outside their small circle. Police also looked into Julian Story's background. He was a local tradesman, known as reliable and kind. Friends said he had mentioned relationship problems in the weeks before his death, including jealousy and frequent arguments. He had even told one friend that he might move out for a while, but it was never clear if he followed through. To the community, Julian's death was both tragic and confusing. There were still more questions than answers. As the investigation continued, police remained tight-lipped about a motive. There were no signs of a break-in or robbery. Nothing valuable seemed to be missing from the house. The theory forming among investigators was that this was a domestic argument that escalated violently. But the level of violence went far beyond what anyone expected. Detectives described the crime scene as one of the most distressing they had ever encountered. Meanwhile, Tamika stayed under psychiatric evaluation. Her court appearances were brief and procedural. Reporters described her as withdrawn, barely responding to questions. At one point, she appeared on a video link wearing a gray jumper, her hair pulled back, staring blankly at the screen as lawyers discussed her case. She did not enter a plea. Her defense requested additional mental health assessments before any formal proceedings. In Port Lincoln, the mood was somber. Locals gathered outside the house, leaving flowers for Julian. Social media filled with tributes. One post read, "Julian, you didn't deserve this. Rest in peace, mate." Another wrote, "We're all heartbroken for your family." Residents who had known the couple struggled to make sense of what had happened. It was difficult to imagine that the same person once smiling on national television could be accused of such horror. The search for the missing head became the central focus of the investigation. Days turned into weeks. Police teams continued to scour coastal scrub, sometimes in cold rain, often finding nothing. Detectives worked long hours reviewing CCTV, hoping to track Tamika's movements in the days following the murder. They traced her possible routes around Port Lincoln, including nearby reserves and beaches. Despite the scale of the operation, the missing head remained unaccounted for, deepening the mystery and the sense of unease. As June turned into July, the case began to shift from an active crime scene to a broader hunt for evidence. Authorities reduced the size of their daily search teams, but continued analyzing data and forensic results. Every new lead seemed to end in another dead end. Still, they kept going, convinced that finding the missing remains would be the key to understanding what truly happened inside that house. By the end of the first month, the community had grown restless. Journalists followed every update, and the public speculated endlessly online about what could have driven Tamika Chesser to such extremes. Theories ranged from mental breakdown to hidden domestic abuse, but police would not confirm any motive. The official line remained simple. The investigation was ongoing, and evidence was still being processed. As the story spread, one truth became clear. The case of Tamika Chesser was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a national obsession, a disturbing reminder that even in quiet towns, behind closed doors, darkness can unfold without warning. And though the initial horror had been discovered, the investigation was far from over. Detectives were convinced that the missing pieces, both physical and emotional, would eventually tell the full story of what happened between Tamika Chesser and Julian Story in that small house on Flinders Highway. The next stage of the investigation would reveal even more shocking turns, pushing the case deeper into public view and testing the limits of justice and human understanding. But for now, all anyone knew was that one life was gone, another was in custody, and a town once known for peace had been changed forever. The investigation into the murder of Julian Story deepened through July 2025, pulling the entire Port Lincoln community into a storm of shock, fear, and fascination. The town that once moved at an easy coastal pace was now filled with police cars, forensic tents, and journalists. Each new day brought another headline, and each headline added a new layer of disbelief. The woman once known for a bubbly appearance on television was now at the center of a grim criminal mystery that no one could make sense of. Police continued their search for Julian's missing head, the final piece of evidence that might explain what had happened and how far Tamika Chesser had gone to hide the crime. The search area stretched from the couple's home on Flinders Highway to the beaches and scrubland on the edge of town. It was slow, methodical work. Dozens of officers combed through dirt and bush, picking through trash, sifting soil, checking drains, and scouring coastlines. They were joined by the state emergency service, volunteers, and even local fishermen who offered to search the water. Each time they thought they had a lead, it dissolved into another dead end. By early July, investigators admitted that the case had reached a difficult phase. The physical search was paused so detectives could re-examine what they already had: forensic evidence, CCTV, and witness statements. They began reviewing hours of video footage from nearby streets, petrol stations, and traffic cameras. They focused on Tamika's movements between June 17th, when Julian was believed to have been killed, and June 19th, when the fire was reported. Detectives wanted to know whether she had left the house during that time, what she carried with her, and where she might have disposed of evidence. Police found that Tamika had been seen walking alone several times during those 2 days, wearing dark clothes and carrying a small backpack. Footage from a service station showed her filling a plastic container with fuel. Investigators suspected that fuel might have been used to start the fire in the backyard where Julian's remains were found. They also noted gaps in her movements, stretches of time when she was unaccounted for, suggesting she could have traveled to secluded spots outside town. At the same time, forensic teams continued analyzing the remains found at the scene. The evidence confirmed that Julian had been killed in a violent struggle. Some parts of his body showed signs of burning. Others were left untouched, as though the fire had been set hastily and abandoned midway. Investigators believe Tamika might have tried to destroy evidence, but lost control of the situation. It was brutal and chaotic, not a planned disposal. As detectives built their timeline, mental health specialists evaluated Tamika's condition. She had been transferred to James Nash House under a psychiatric detention order. Court documents revealed she was undergoing assessment for possible psychosis or dissociative behavior. Her legal team stated that she was unfit to enter a plea and needed further observation. Reporters who attended her brief video court appearances described her as emotionless, staring into space, speaking only when prompted. The contrast between her current state and her former public image was stark. The once lively reality TV contestant now appeared disconnected from reality, her expression vacant, her demeanor subdued. Back in Port Lincoln, the house on Flinders Highway remained sealed off with police tape. It had become a symbol of everything the town didn't want to remember. Locals avoided passing it. Those who did said the sight left a chill. Forensic officers came and went for weeks, collecting evidence, testing surfaces, and mapping the interior in detail. Every corner of the property told part of the story. Scorch marks near the chair, blood traces in the hallway, and personal belongings scattered as if there had been a sudden, violent fight. Julian's family, who lived in another part of South Australia, traveled to Port Lincoln to work with police and arrange a small memorial. His sister spoke briefly to the press, describing him as a kind, hard-working man who loved the ocean and his family. They pleaded for privacy, but also urged anyone with information to come forward. Their grief became another layer of the tragedy, a family searching for answers that even the investigators didn't yet have. By mid-July, new momentum came from the review of CCTV footage. Detectives spotted what appeared to be Tamika walking through a parkland area, carrying a large bag late at night on June 18th. That discovery reignited the search. Police teams returned to the area and expanded their operation. They searched drainage ditches, bins, and dense bushland, often in poor weather. Officers spoke to residents nearby, asking if anyone had noticed foul smells, disturbed soil, or unusual activity around those days. Still, the missing head remained unfound. Detectives publicly acknowledged that the search was one of the most difficult they had faced. The terrain around Port Lincoln, a mix of coastal cliffs, forest, and open farmland, made it easy to hide evidence. For weeks, police dogs picked up faint scents that led nowhere. The community's patience wore thin. Some locals started theories of their own. A few believed Tamika might have thrown the head into the ocean. Others thought it might still be buried near the house. Online, speculation turned cruel. People who remembered her from television flooded social media, with comments ranging from shock to disgust. Her name, once attached to light-hearted entertainment, was now associated with one of the country's darkest crimes. In late July, after several weeks of frustration, a break finally came, though at first it seemed like a random event. A dog walker strolling through scrubland near Hindmar Street, about 2 kilometers from the crime scene, noticed something strange among the dry grass. At first glance, it looked like part of an animal's skull. The walker called police. Forensic officers arrived quickly and confirmed that the find was human. They closed off the area, worked into the night, and transported the remains to Adelaide for testing. Days later, police confirmed what many feared. The skull belonged to Julian Story. DNA analysis matched samples from earlier remains. The discovery marked the turning point of the entire investigation. It proved that Tamika had carried parts of the body away from the house after murder, most likely during the 2-day gap before the fire. Detectives now had a clearer picture of the sequence. Julian was killed around June 17th, dismembered inside the unit, and partially burned 2 days later when Tamika tried to dispose of what was left. The rest, including the head, had been dumped elsewhere, likely under cover of night. The news of the discovery sent shockwaves through Port Lincoln. Locals who had been following the case closely felt both relief and horror. For Julian's family, it was confirmation of their worst fears, but also a form of closure. Police publicly thanked the community for its help and said the find would allow them to finalize their forensic reconstruction. After the discovery, attention turned back to Tamika's mental state and the looming legal process. Prosecutors began preparing their case, confident that the physical evidence, DNA, fuel traces, and forensic reports would hold up in court. The defense continued to emphasize her psychological condition, hinting that she may have been in a dissociative or psychotic state at the time of the crime. Still, no formal plea was entered. She remained in psychiatric care under heavy supervision, with each court hearing lasting only minutes. In the weeks that followed, the intensity of media coverage faded slightly, but the story never truly left the headlines. Each update from police, each court appearance, reignited national interest. Port Lincoln slowly began returning to its routines, though the memory of the case lingered everywhere, in conversations at cafes, in news bulletins, and in the quiet stretch of highway where the tragedy began. The discovery of Julian Story's skull brought the investigation to its final phase. The facts were clearer now, but the deeper questions, what exactly happened in those final hours and why, were still waiting for answers. Those answers would come only later, when the court proceedings unfolded and the full story of Tamika Chesser's actions and state of mind came to light. For now, the town remained caught between grief and disbelief, struggling to understand how something so horrific could have happened in their midst. By August 2025, the case of Tamika Chesser had moved from frantic investigation to the long, careful process of the courts. With the discovery of Julian Story's head, the evidence was complete. Police had finished their forensic work and formally handed the case to prosecutors. What had started as a small-town tragedy had become one of Australia's most haunting murder cases in years. The community of Port Lincoln was still reeling. For weeks, residents spoke in quiet tones about what had happened, often lowering their voices when mentioning the house on Flinders Highway. The property stood empty behind police tape, its windows covered and its garden overgrown. It had become a place people avoided, a reminder of violence that felt too close to home. Journalists had mostly left by then, but the story remained on national news, a constant symbol of a life that had spiraled from reality TV to real-life horror. Inside the legal system, Tamika Chesser remained under a strict psychiatric detention order at James Nash House in Adelaide. Reports described her mental state as fragile, with doctors monitoring her closely. For months, psychiatrists examined her behavior, history, and medical records to determine whether she was mentally fit to stand trial. Court documents revealed she had struggled with depression and erratic behavior in the years before the crime. Friends who had known her from her television days said fame had faded quickly, leaving her feeling isolated and unstable. When she finally appeared in court, the atmosphere was heavy. She was brought in through a side entrance, wearing plain clothing, her hair tied back, surrounded by security officers. Her face was pale, expression unreadable. The courtroom was filled with reporters, Julian's family members, and legal officials who had followed the case from the start. The judge ordered silence as the charges were read: murder, interference with human remains, and attempting to pervert the course of justice. The prosecution presented the timeline the investigation had uncovered. According to their case, Tamika killed Julian on or around June 17th after an argument that turned violent. Evidence showed signs of a struggle in the living room. They believed she used a sharp object, though the exact weapon was never recovered. Afterward, she dismembered the body, tried to burn the remains in the backyard, and attempted to conceal the evidence by scattering parts of it in nearby scrubland. The prosecution also noted that she had purchased fuel the day before the fire and was seen carrying bags late at night around Port Lincoln. Forensic experts testified that the burns found on Julian's remains were inconsistent, suggesting the fire was brief and uncontrolled. They confirmed DNA matches between the skull found in the scrubland and the body discovered in the yard. The coroner stated that the cause of death was consistent with blunt force trauma, followed by dismemberment and attempted burning. As the evidence was presented, the defense focused on Tamika's state of mind. Her lawyer told the court that she had been suffering from severe mental illness and was not fully aware of her actions. They described her as having a psychotic breakdown, claiming she experienced delusions and paranoia in the days leading up to the killing. Witnesses from her past spoke about erratic behavior and emotional instability. Mental health specialists testified that she showed signs of dissociation, explaining her silence and detached state when police arrived. For the court, the question was whether her illness had made her legally insane at the time of the crime. After weeks of psychiatric review and testimony, the court ruled that Tamika was fit to stand trial, but accepted that her mental health had played a significant role. The trial continued under strict conditions, with media restrictions to protect ongoing psychiatric evaluations. When the verdict came, it was grim. The jury found Tamika Chesser guilty of murdering Julian Story, though her mental impairment was formally recognized. The judge described the case as a tragedy born from instability, isolation, and untreated illness. In sentencing, he spoke about the brutality of the act and the suffering inflicted on Julian's family. He also acknowledged that Tamika's mental condition was a major factor, noting that she would serve her sentence under psychiatric supervision rather than in a standard prison. The court ordered that she remain in secure detention for a minimum term, subject to review by medical and legal authorities. The judge stated that her eventual release would depend entirely on psychiatric evaluations, confirming she was no longer a danger to herself or others. For Julian Story's family, the decision brought some closure, but no relief. His sister addressed the court, saying, "Julian was a gentle soul who didn't deserve this. Our only comfort is knowing the truth is finally known." Her voice broke as she spoke of the pain of losing a brother in such horrific circumstances and the years it would take to heal. In Port Lincoln, people tried to move on, though the memory lingered. The case had forced the town to confront issues of domestic violence and mental health, subjects that often stayed hidden behind closed doors. Local organizations began holding community forums, encouraging people to speak up about relationship violence and to seek help before it was too late. Tamika Chesser's name faded slowly from the headlines, replaced by other stories, but her case remained a dark chapter in Australian true crime history. A once famous face turned symbol of tragedy. Her fall was complete, from the lights of television to the isolation of a locked psychiatric unit. The house where everything happened was eventually sold, its walls repainted, its garden cleared, but for the people who lived nearby, it would always be the place where Julian Story's life ended. The case closed with more questions and answers about love, anger, and the thin line between reason and madness. And though justice had been served in the courtroom, the story of Tamika Chesser and Julian Story left behind an ache that no verdict could erase. In 2006, New York City lost one of its brightest talents, actress and filmmaker Adrienne Shelly. What first appeared to be a heartbreaking suicide soon unraveled into a shocking murder. An ordinary day turned fatal, exposing fear, desperation, and the relentless pursuit of truth behind one woman's tragic final hours. It was a calm autumn morning in New York City, the kind of day when the city's rhythm feels steady and alive. In the heart of Manhattan, inside a modest apartment in Greenwich Village, 40-year-old Adrienne Shelly was at work. She was an actress, writer, and director, someone who had already left her mark on independent film, but was still striving for more. Known for her roles in Hal Hartley's The Unbelievable Truth and Trust, Adrienne had built a reputation for portraying quiet strength and emotional depth. But by 2006, she was ready to move from in front of the camera to behind it. Her latest project, a small film called Waitress, had recently wrapped production. It was a story she wrote and directed herself, about a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage who finds hope through unexpected change. The film carried the same warmth and honesty that defined Adrienne's work and her life. She lived in a cozy apartment on Abingdon Square, a short walk from her family home. It wasn't luxurious, but it had charm. The apartment doubled as her office, a quiet space where she could write and edit in peace. Adrienne balanced her creative work with being a devoted wife and mother. Her husband, Andy Ostroy, was a successful marketing executive, and their 3-year-old daughter, Sophie, was the light of their lives. Friends described Adrienne as warm, thoughtful, and full of energy. Her life seemed balanced, filled with purpose and love. In early November 2006, the city buzzed with its usual rhythm, taxis, conversations, the hum of construction echoing through the streets. Inside Adrienne's building, renovation work was underway. A small crew of construction workers, mostly immigrants, were repairing and painting apartments. Among them was a young man named Diego Pilco, just 19 years old, from Ecuador. He lived in Brooklyn and worked long days for low pay, sending money back home to support his family. Quiet and soft-spoken, Diego had been in the country for only a few years. His English was limited, and he was constantly worried about losing his job. He was one of the many unseen workers who kept New York's buildings alive, moving from one renovation site to another, earning barely enough to survive. Adrienne had crossed paths with the workers several times. They shared the same hallways and elevators. For her, they were just part of the background noise of the city. Young men doing a job. But for Diego, even small interactions carry tension. He worked under pressure, afraid of complaints that could cost him his position. On November 1, 2006, that tension quietly set the stage for a tragedy that no one could have imagined. That morning, Adrienne left her home to spend the day writing. She kissed her daughter goodbye and promised to be home for dinner. Around noon, she was in her apartment, focused on her work, while Diego and others were finishing tasks in the building. Noise from the renovation drifted through the walls, hammering, scraping, the usual sounds of construction. Adrienne, who needed quiet to focus, stepped out to speak to the workers. Accounts later suggested she asked them to keep the noise down. It was a simple, polite request, nothing out of the ordinary. But to Diego, who already felt nervous about complaints, it sounded like a threat. In his mind, if she reported him, he could be fired. He carried that fear with him as he returned to his work, frustration growing into something darker. By late afternoon, Andy tried calling Adrienne several times, but got no answer. That wasn't like her. She was always reachable, especially with a young child at home. When she still didn't respond by evening, Andy grew anxious. He decided to go to her apartment. It was around 5:45 p.m. when he arrived. The door was locked, but he had a key. Inside, everything looked normal at first glance. Quiet, tidy, no signs of a struggle. Then, in the bathroom, Andy found Adrienne. She was hanging from the shower rod with a bedsheet tied around her neck. For a moment, everything stopped. Shock and disbelief took over. Andy screamed for help, and police were called immediately. Detectives arrived, examined the scene, and began their routine investigation. There were no broken locks, no forced entry, no clear evidence of a break-in. To them, it looked like a suicide. The position of her body, the sheet, and the setting all suggested she had taken her own life. The case was quickly classified as such. But something didn't sit right with Andy. He couldn't accept that explanation. Adrienne had no history of depression, no reason to end her life. Just days earlier, she had been excited about Waitress being accepted to the Sundance Film Festival. She had plans, career goals, family dreams. He told investigators that she was happy, not hopeless. He pushed for them to look deeper. At first, it seemed like grief speaking, but Andy's persistence made detectives re-examine the evidence. A day later, a small but crucial clue surfaced, a dusty footprint on the toilet seat near Adrienne's body. It was from a work boot, not something she would have worn. That single detail didn't fit the story of suicide. Investigators realized someone else might have been there. The direction of the case began to shift. Detectives started questioning people connected to the building. They spoke with neighbors, maintenance staff, and construction workers. Among the workers was Diego Pilco. When they first talked to him, he seemed calm but nervous. He said he didn't know much about the woman, only that she had complained once about noise. He denied entering her apartment. His English was broken, and through a translator, he repeated that he had nothing to do with what happened. But detectives noticed inconsistencies in his story, small details that didn't line up. They also learned that Diego had been in the building around the same time Adrienne was last seen alive. As investigators pressed harder, the picture began to change. The neat surface of the supposed suicide started to crack. What had seemed like a private tragedy was now looking more like a crime. Forensic teams examined the scene again, this time treating it as a potential homicide. They found more subtle signs of struggle, marks on Adrienne's neck that didn't quite match self-inflicted hanging. The autopsy confirmed it. She had been strangled before she was hung. That revelation changed everything. Adrienne Shelley's death was no longer considered a suicide. It was murder, and the quiet construction worker who had seemed harmless just days earlier was now under a growing cloud of suspicion. As the city moved through another busy week, detectives followed the trail that would soon expose the truth about what happened inside that apartment on Abingdon Square. A simple noise complaint, a frightened worker, and a moment of panic had collided to end the life of a woman whose story was still being written. The investigation was now in full motion, but the answers would come slowly. and they would reveal a crime that shocked even the most seasoned detectives in New York City. As detectives reopened the case, the tone inside the precinct shifted from routine procedure to focused pursuit. The discovery of that single dusty footprint had transformed what everyone believed to be a suicide into a possible homicide. Adrian Shelley's husband, Andy Ostroy, was now both heartbroken and relentless. He called the police every day, demanding progress, refusing to let the case fade. His intuition had been right. Something about the scene never fit the woman he knew. Adrian had been joyful, busy, full of energy and creative drive. She was preparing for Sundance, helping raise her daughter, and mapping out her next project. The idea that she would quietly end her life simply didn't match the truth of who she was. Investigators from the NYPD's 6th Precinct began to reconstruct Adrienne's final day hour by hour. The last confirmed sighting of her was around noon on November 1, 2006. A neighbor had seen her entering the building after stepping out for coffee. Construction work had been ongoing in the apartment below hers, and the workers on site included a few young men from Latin America. Among them was 19-year-old Diego Pilco, who had emigrated from Ecuador in search of better opportunities. He lived with roommates in a small Brooklyn apartment, earning less than $500 a week through cash jobs for a contractor who paid him under the table. Detectives learned that Adrian had politely complained about the noise in the building earlier that day. It wasn't unusual. Residents often made noise complaints during renovations, but for Diego, that simple interaction became something else entirely. Through a translator, he told police that he'd been afraid she would report him to his boss, costing him his job. He had no legal papers and couldn't afford to be fired. His fear grew into anger and panic, emotions that would later drive him to a reckless act he couldn't undo. In the early stages of questioning, Diego stuck to his story. He claimed he had never entered Adrienne's apartment, saying he worked in a different part of the building and left in the afternoon. But police knew more than he realized. The footprint on the toilet matched his work boots, and the time of death estimated by the medical examiner placed him at the building during the critical window. Detectives brought him in for formal interrogation, this time with an interpreter present. He sat in a small, brightly lit room, hands clasped tightly, his voice low and unsure. The detectives started gently, asking about his work and his movements that day. At first, his answers were consistent. But as hours passed, the calm exterior began to crumble. When confronted with the forensic evidence, the footprint, the autopsy results, and witness timelines, Diego's voice wavered. He looked down, avoiding eye contact. After several hours, he changed his story. He admitted he had gone to Adrienne's apartment, but insisted it was only to talk, to explain himself after the noise complaint. He said she yelled at him, and in the heat of the moment, he pushed her. He claimed she hit her head and collapsed. That was the first version of his confession. But investigators knew there was more. The autopsy showed signs of manual strangulation, pressure marks on her neck, broken blood vessels in her eyes, and bruising inconsistent with a fall. The story about a push didn't fit the evidence. After another round of questioning, Diego broke down further. In tears, he confessed that he had panicked after Adrienne fell. Afraid she was dead, he tried to make it look like a suicide to hide what he had done. It was a partial truth, but still not the full picture. Meanwhile, the Shelley family was living through unimaginable grief. Andy tried to shield their daughter from the chaos, but he was consumed by anger and disbelief. Friends of Adrienne gathered to remember her, fellow filmmakers, actors, and artists. They spoke of her kindness, her humor, and her talent. Her unfinished dreams made the tragedy feel even heavier. To the public, the case quickly drew attention. A beloved actress and filmmaker, gone in such a brutal and confusing way, captured headlines across New York and beyond. While the press speculated, detectives continued to press Diego. They needed to confirm whether the act was accidental or intentional. The turning point came when forensic experts re-examined fibers from the bedsheet used to hang Adrienne. The knots, the height of the shower rod, and the position of her body all indicated deliberate staging. Whoever had done it took time to make it appear like suicide. That wasn't a reaction to panic. It was an attempt to cover up a crime. Detectives returned to confront Diego with these details. He sat silently for several minutes, then began speaking again, his voice shaking. This time, his words carried guilt and exhaustion. He said that after Adrian complained, he followed her to her apartment to argue. He was angry, not thinking clearly. When she threatened to call the building manager, he snapped. In his own words, "I lost control." He grabbed her, covered her mouth, and choked her. When she stopped moving, fear replaced anger. He realized what he had done. To save himself, he arranged the scene to look like she had taken her own life, and then he left. But this version, too, was not immediately public. The full confession would come later in court, and for now, detectives only hinted to the media that a suspect was in custody. They worked carefully to build the case. They searched Diego's apartment, collected his clothing and work boots, and confirmed through his employer that he was at the site that day. The evidence lined up. Everything pointed to one conclusion: Adrian Shelley had been murdered, and the killer was a teenager who had been painting just a few floors away. Outside of the investigation, the story rippled through the independent film community. Adrienne's movie Waitress, which she wrote and directed, was scheduled to premiere at Sundance a few months later. The cast, including Kerry Russell and Nathan Fillion, were devastated. What had been a celebration of new beginnings became a memorial for its creator. Andy made the decision to go forward with the film's release. He believed it was what Adrian would have wanted. The movie became both her final work and her legacy. In the months following the arrest, more details about Diego's life emerged. He had come from a poor farming family in Ecuador and moved to New York to earn money for them. He spoke little English and lived in fear of deportation. His employer had hired him illegally, like many others, for cheap labor. It didn't excuse what he did, but it painted a picture of a young man burdened by desperation and poor judgment. Back at home, Andy struggled to rebuild life for himself and Sophie. He kept Adrienne's memory alive in every way he could, through her work, through stories, through their daughter. He also began to advocate for justice, speaking publicly about how the system had failed to investigate properly at first. He wanted to make sure no other family had to fight that same battle. As winter set in, the case slowly made its way through the legal process. Diego was charged with second-degree murder. His defense lawyers tried to argue that the act wasn't premeditated, that it was an accident driven by fear. Prosecutors, however, saw it differently. They believed it was intentional, that after strangling Adrian, he had made a calculated effort to stage the scene and mislead investigators. The city waited for answers. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse during hearings, capturing brief glimpses of Diego as he was led in handcuffs past the cameras. He kept his head down, saying nothing. Inside, prosecutors presented the evidence piece by piece: the footprint, the autopsy findings, and his changing stories. For the Shelley family, every appearance in court reopened the wound. Yet, amid the sorrow, there was one quiet certainty: Adrienne's truth was finally being heard. The case that began as a tragedy mistaken for suicide was now a story of justice inching forward. The next steps would determine whether Diego's words would match his actions, and whether the legal system could bring closure to a family forever changed. By early 2007, the investigation into Adrian Shelley's death had moved from shock to resolution. The man accused of killing her, 19-year-old Diego Pilco, sat in custody at Rikers Island, awaiting trial. In the months since his arrest, public interest in the case had grown. Adrian wasn't just a victim. She was a beloved figure in the independent film world. Her work had touched audiences, and her final film, Waitress, was on the verge of its Sundance premiere. Every article about her death balanced tragedy with disbelief. How could a woman so full of life, talent, and kindness be gone because of something so senseless? Inside the courtroom, the mood was heavy. The prosecution built its case methodically, using both forensic evidence and Diego's own words. They described the timeline of events that day, from the noise complaint to the confrontation and the cover-up. Prosecutors emphasized that this wasn't a random act. It was anger, panic, and fear colliding in a single fatal moment. Adrienne's family sat through each hearing, hearing details that no one should ever have to endure. Andy Ostroy, quiet but determined, was there every time. He wanted to make sure Adrienne's story was told truthfully and completely. Diego's defense team tried to shift the picture. They didn't deny that he caused Adrienne's death, but they insisted it wasn't intentional murder. They said he had reacted impulsively, frightened that he might lose his job and be deported. Their goal was to reduce the charge from murder to manslaughter. They painted him as a young, uneducated immigrant, overwhelmed by fear and regret. They emphasized that he hadn't gone to Adrienne's apartment to kill her, only to talk. But the prosecution countered that whatever his intent at the start, his actions afterward proved consciousness of guilt. He didn't call for help. He didn't tell anyone what happened. He staged the scene to look like suicide and walked away, leaving Adrienne's husband to find her. In court, investigators recounted how they pieced the case together. The footprint on the toilet seat, the bruises inconsistent with suicide, the autopsy confirming strangulation before hanging. Each detail dismantled the early assumption that Adrienne had taken her own life. The detectives described the interrogation, how Diego's story shifted again and again before he finally confessed. His final version matched the evidence. He had followed Adrienne into her apartment, attacked her, and then hung her body to make it appear self-inflicted. His words were calm and emotionless, but the horror of them was clear. During the trial, Andy spoke publicly for the first time about his wife. He described Adrienne as someone who saw beauty in everything. She was a mother who adored her daughter, a woman filled with creativity and compassion. His voice shook when he talked about finding her that day, about how the system's first conclusion, that she had taken her own life, nearly robbed her of justice. He thanked the investigators who listened when he refused to accept the easy answer. For him, the fight wasn't just about punishment, it was about truth. Outside the courtroom, public discussion of the case touched on broader issues: workplace safety, immigrant labor conditions, and the flaws in how crimes are initially classified. Many were disturbed by how close the case came to being dismissed as suicide. Others focused on Diego's background, debating whether poverty and fear could explain his actions. But at the center of everything remained Adrienne, an artist who had been silenced just as her career was reaching its peak. As the months passed, Diego's legal team negotiated with prosecutors. Facing overwhelming evidence, he agreed to a plea deal. In February 2008, he pled guilty to first-degree manslaughter. The confession was simple and final. He admitted that he had followed Adrienne to her apartment, argued with her, and strangled her in a moment of rage. Then, realizing she was dead, he hung her body to make it appear like suicide. His words were translated in court, spoken without resistance. He said he never meant to kill her, but the courtroom was silent. Intent no longer mattered. The outcome was irreversible. When sentencing came, Adrienne's family filled the room. Andy stood to deliver his victim impact statement. His words were direct and heartbreaking. He spoke about Adrienne's laughter, her patience, and how much their daughter resembled her. He talked about Sophie growing up without her mother, about birthdays and milestones that would forever carry a shadow. He told Diego exactly what his actions had done, not just to one woman, but to an entire family. The judge listened quietly, then delivered the sentence: 25 years in prison. There would be no parole for a long time. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served, though it could never fill the absence Adrienne left behind. After the trial, Andy dedicated himself to preserving Adrienne's legacy. He established the Adrienne Shelley Foundation, an organization that supports female filmmakers through grants and scholarships. The goal was to continue what Adrienne had started, to help women find their voice in an industry where opportunities were often limited. Over the years, the foundation has supported dozens of projects, each one carrying a small piece of Adrienne's spirit forward. In the months following her death, Waitress premiered at the Sundance Film Festival. The film received a standing ovation. Audiences fell in love with its warmth, humor, and honesty, qualities that reflected Adrienne's own nature. The movie's success was bittersweet. She never saw the applause, never felt the joy of watching her story connect with people. But her husband, her friends, and her colleagues made sure her presence was felt in every frame. The film went on to inspire a Broadway musical, further cementing her influence in the world she loved. The story of Adrienne Shelly is both heartbreaking and revealing. It shows how easily the truth can be buried, and how persistence can bring it back to light. It's the story of a woman who had everything to live for, taken by a senseless act of fear and anger. It's also the story of a husband who refused to let her be forgotten, who fought against every assumption until justice was done. The theme that runs through it all is the fragility of life and the power of truth. One careless moment changed countless lives, but the determination to uncover that truth became a testament to love and resilience. Years later, Diego Pilco remains in prison. He will spend most of his adult life behind bars, paying for the life he took. Adrienne's daughter, Sophie, has grown up surrounded by reminders of her mother's talent and kindness. Andy continues to speak about Adrienne's legacy, advocating for victim rights and supporting artists in her name. Time has passed, but the pain remains, a quiet, enduring echo of what was lost. In the end, Adrienne's story is not just about death. It's about everything she created while she was alive. Her art, her laughter, her compassion. All of it survives in the people she touched and the work she left behind. Her story, though born from tragedy, continues to inspire. The woman who once told stories about courage and second chances became, in a way, a symbol of both. The case of Adrienne Shelly remains one of the most haunting in New York's history, not only because of the crime itself, but because it revealed the human strength that can rise from devastation. And though justice came late, it came because one voice refused to go silent, just as Adrienne's never truly will.